Welcome to Karen's HOA Nightmares. Get ready for the most outrageous, shocking, and downright hilarious tales from the world of homeowners associations. In today's story, in Pine Lake, Tommy Barnes, a fire department veteran, faces Nina Michael from the HOA, who demands he remove his family's gate, claiming it violates emergency access standards. But Tommy quickly realizes Nina is targeting his property for development, using fake documents and manipulation to pressure him into selling below market value. Instead of complying, Tommy upgrades his gate with advanced emergency features, documenting every move Nina makes. With help from his neighbor Michelle Cruz and retired lawyer Hannah Williams, Tommy exposes Nina's fraud, turning the tables and protecting his property while unveiling a widespread scam in their community. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest hot stories. The HOA's demand to remove my gate arrived like a sledgehammer, leaving me no choice but to respond. They claimed my gate violated community access standards and demanded I remove it immediately. The thing is, the gate had been protecting my property for decades without issue. No complaints about emergency vehicle access, no safety concerns, just a manufactured excuse to force compliance. They expected me to panic, pay up, and cave like every other homeowner, but I wasn't having it. I looked them straight in the eye and said, "I'll review your requirements thoroughly." What I was really planning was to flip their entire scheme on its head. They wanted community access? I'd give them something they never expected. It was a perfect Saturday morning, and I was replacing rotting deck boards when Nina Michael showed up at my gate, acting like she owned the place. She had this polished confidence, the kind you see on people who have perfected their intimidation tactics. You could tell she had done this before with other homeowners, who probably caved without asking questions. But I wasn't just any homeowner. As a fire department professional, I didn't back down easily. The minute she showed up, I knew something didn't feel right. My grandfather's cabin sits on a prime piece of real estate in Pine Lake, a property that used to be worth maybe $60,000 in the 1970s. Now, it's worth $185,000, and with subdivision potential, it could easily fetch $420,000 for developers. I could see the dollar signs in Nina's eyes. She wasn't focused on my gate, she was focused on making a quick profit off my property. She introduced herself with a tone that left no room for doubt. "Your gate violates HOA emergency access standards and requires immediate modifications," she said, throwing down some official-looking papers. But this whole situation felt off. The papers she handed me didn't have specific code references, easement documentation, or even clear citations. Just generic safety language that sounded official, but lacked real substance. As a fire department veteran, I knew that if someone wanted to challenge an emergency access requirement, they needed real, legitimate documentation. Nina couldn't provide that. I pushed back, asking her to show me the easement documents or provide a specific National Fire Protection Association (NFPA) code that required residential gate removal. Her pause wasn't one of surprise, it was one of recalculation. She wasn't expecting someone who knew the regulations and could challenge her demands. Nina quickly shifted her language, throwing around terms like liability, compliance, and evolving standards. It was clear she was using buzzwords to sound like a property development expert, rather than someone genuinely concerned about emergency access. While Nina rambled about insurance liability, I watched her take systematic photographs of my property, angles, measurements, access routes. All the things that mattered for a potential subdivision, not emergency access. That's when I realized her real intentions. This wasn't about fire trucks. She was planning to develop the land, and my gate was just an obstacle in her way. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. That afternoon, I installed basic motion sensors around my property. I trusted my instincts as a fire department professional, knowing that this wouldn't be the last visit, and that the next encounter might not be as polite. Later that night, the motion sensors paid off when they triggered at exactly 2 a.m. I watched from my bedroom window as someone, likely working with Nina, was out there with professional laser measuring equipment, documenting my gate's dimensions, clearance heights, and potential subdivision sightlines. This wasn't some random vandal. It was a calculated operation to gather intel for a much bigger plan than just emergency vehicle access. The next day, I shared my suspicions with my neighbor Michelle Cruz, who had always been a kind-hearted person with a genuine concern for the community. But when I spoke with her, I realized she had been manipulated by Nina's campaign. Michelle expressed real concerns about emergency access, but the way she mentioned insurance terminology made me suspicious. It was the same language Nina had used. That was when I realized Nina had weaponized Michelle's health fears to create a false narrative around my gate and my property. That evening, I drove through Pine Lake, cataloging the changes around me. 2 new residents, Wilson and Foster, had moved into properties recently purchased at suspiciously low prices, well below market value. And both properties, like mine, had subdivision potential. Something wasn't right, and I knew I had to dig deeper. My suspicions grew when I saw Tom Wilson walking my property at 11 p.m. with measuring tape and a digital camera. He wasn't being sneaky about it, and it was clear from his movements that he was documenting my property boundaries, not looking for emergency access issues. His actions screamed property assessment, not neighborhood concern. I spent the next day gathering evidence, cross-referencing property transactions and discovering that both Wilson and Foster had purchased their homes far below market value, using a fake employment address to verify their credentials. This was no coincidence. They were part of Nina's scheme to acquire my property and others like it. After a series of covert meetings, I realized the full extent of Nina's operation. She wasn't just targeting my property. She had infiltrated the entire neighborhood with accomplices, using fabricated emergencies and fake paperwork to pressure homeowners into selling for below market prices. Michelle's concerns were real, but they had been twisted and used against me by Nina's scheme. With everything in place, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to back down. I began making preparations to document everything, including recording the full extent of Nina's harassment. As I installed surveillance systems and motion sensors around my property, I realized that I wasn't just defending my gate anymore. I was preparing for a legal battle that would expose Nina and her criminal operation. What followed next would be the turning point in this battle, and it was clear that Nina wasn't ready for the fight that was about to come her way. The upgrade plan includes visible emergency compliance features that exceed every county standard Catherine could possibly reference in her manufactured violation notices. Wider vehicle turnaround space that accommodates fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency equipment beyond anything required by residential access codes. Professional emergency lighting systems with backup power that illuminate access routes for night emergency response operations. Knoxbox key access system that provides immediate emergency vehicle entry without requiring gate removal or property owner presence. Automatic emergency vehicle recognition that triggers gate opening for any vehicle broadcasting emergency frequency signals. Every feature represents a legitimate emergency access enhancement that makes Nina's compliance demands look ridiculous by comparison. The hidden capabilities embedded within legitimate emergency infrastructure represent the real strategic advantage Nina won't discover until her criminal conspiracy is already documented for prosecution. Surveillance cameras built directly into lighting fixtures capture high-definition footage with night vision capabilities and motion-activated recording protocols. Audio recording equipment disguised as security enhancement monitors every conversation within 50 ft of my gate with crystal-clear sound quality. An electronic access logging system documents every visitor with timestamps, vehicle identification, and digital photographs for a comprehensive security database. Legal compliance requires audio-video recording on premises signs, which I explained to neighbors as enhanced security protection for our entire area against property crime and suspicious activity. Wednesday morning brings contractor arrival for installation that appears to be an expensive property improvement, but actually represents a sophisticated evidence collection system. Deployment professional emergency access contractors who specialize in fire department compliance requirements, working with surveillance equipment specialists who know how to embed recording capabilities within legitimate infrastructure without detection. The installation draws positive attention from genuine neighbors who appreciate authentic property enhancement. While Nina and her accomplices probably think I'm spending money, I can't afford modifications that prove their pressure campaign is working. What they don't realize is that every dollar I'm investing in this upgrade will pay for itself when their criminal conspiracy evidence gets them prosecuted for systematic property fraud. Michelle stops by on Wednesday afternoon to admire the professional emergency access features and express genuine appreciation for the neighborhood security enhancement. "This looks incredible, Tommy. Professional emergency access with neighborhood security benefits. Much better than Nina's suggestion to just remove the gate completely, she tells me while examining the knock system and emergency lighting installation. Her positive response confirms what I suspected about Nina's manipulation tactics. Genuine community members appreciate authentic improvement over manufactured compliance surrender. Michelle's authentic concern about emergency vehicle access gets satisfied by real emergency access enhancement, which eliminates Nina's ability to weaponize her medical fears for artificial community pressure against my property. Thursday evening systems testing confirms that concealed surveillance equipment captures crystal clearer footage, while emergency access features work perfectly, according to professional fire department standards. Sirens trigger automatic gate opening. Within 3 seconds, Knox provides immediate key access for emergency responders and vehicle clearances. Exceed all NNFPA requirements for residential emergency vehicle access. Hidden cameras capture high-definition surveillance footage with a 60-foot range and automatic night vision activation. Audio recording picks up conversations with professional clarity, and electronic logging creates a comprehensive visitor database with timestamps and digital photographs. Nina's compliance arguments just became completely obsolete, while her criminal activities are about to become completely documented. The mic caught her on a call about subdivision sightlines and drainage, and the lens finally had a face. Nina, not some prowler walking the same angles as before, now with a name. She's not checking emergency vehicle clearance like her violation notices claimed. She's documenting subdivision sightlines, property boundary markers, access routes for multiple lot development, and infrastructure requirements for residential development projects. The footage shows Nina measuring angles that have nothing to do with emergency compliance and everything to do with property subdivision planning for maximum development profit. Her systematic documentation reveals property acquisition planning rather than HOA enforcement, which means I now have video evidence of her real intentions for my inherited corner lot. The way Nina moves around my property suggests familiarity with development site assessment techniques rather than casual HOA compliance checking. She photographs potential utility connection points, measures distances between property boundaries and existing structures, and documents soil drainage patterns that would affect foundation work for new construction. Hidden audio captures her phone conversation about environmental assessment timeline and subdivision approval, complications that confirm systematic property development planning rather than emergency access enforcement. She thinks she's conducting private property reconnaissance while I'm asleep, but what she's actually doing is providing evidence of criminal conspiracy for property acquisition fraud that'll destroy her entire operation. What really satisfies me about Thursday night's surveillance footage is watching Nina conduct her professional property assessment, completely unaware that every measurement, every photograph, every phone conversation is being recorded with court-admissible quality. She thinks my expensive upgrade eliminated her compliance arguments and proved her pressure campaign is financially stressing me toward distressed sale consideration. What she doesn't realize is that my compliance upgrade actually created a high-define recording studio that's documenting her systematic property fraud in real time. The next time she shows up with manufactured emergency requirements or fake inspector credentials, I'll be ready with evidence that proves criminal conspiracy for property acquisition rather than legitimate emergency compliance enforcement. Nina thinks my expensive upgrade eliminated her compliance arguments forever. She has no idea I just installed a high-defin recording studio that's about to document every criminal word she says. What would you have done with that vacant office building discovery I made about Wilson and Foster? Tell me in the comments. When someone tries to intimidate you with fake authority, do you back down or do you get strategic like this? Friday morning brings Michael Stevens' official county inspection, and my hidden surveillance captures something beautiful. A fake government official attempting to manufacture violations for Nina's property acquisition scheme while having no clue that every word is being recorded in high definition. Michael arrives at 9:15 sharp, displaying county credentials with the kind of nervous confidence you see in people who've practiced their authority performance but aren't quite comfortable with the deception they're running. Mr. Barnes, I'm here for a mandatory emergency access compliance assessment, he announces, while my concealed cameras document his systematic search for problems that don't exist. What he doesn't realize is that my emergency access upgrades exceed every possible county standard, which means he's about to expose himself as either incompetent or fraudulent. The technical challenge begins immediately. when I start asking specific questions that any legitimate county inspector should answer without hesitation. Here's what our county actually adopts. Residential Knox box remains an accepted access method, and your form lists no enforceable section number. If you have a citation, read it now. Chapter, section, and revision year. These aren't trick questions. They're basic emergency access protocols that every county building inspector learns during certification training. Michael starts fumbling through his clipboard immediately, producing documents that cite regulations I've never heard of in 12 years of fire department work. Current emergency access protocols require updated compliance standards that exceed traditional Knox implementation. He responds with the kind of vague authority that sounds official without actually meaning anything specific. Michael's struggles become obvious when he can't provide actual technical specifications that his credentials should verify without any difficulty. He produces these official-looking documents, citing regulations that don't exist in any NFPA standards I've studied, giving contradictory answers when pressed for the specific code sections that supposedly require my gate modifications. Residential emergency vehicle access requirements have evolved beyond 1990s. Knox box systems to require comprehensive clearance compliance, he tells me while examining my upgrades that clearly exceed every possible standard. The way he avoids specific citations and relies on generic compliance language suggests someone working from a script rather than actual technical knowledge. My hidden surveillance equipment captures every stammering response as Michael realizes he's dealing with someone who actually knows emergency access requirements rather than some intimidated homeowner who will accept whatever authority he presents. Emergency access protocol updates require property modifications that exceed traditional compliance standards, he explains while photographing my gate features that clearly provide better emergency access than anything required by county regulations. What he doesn't understand is that my concealed audio recording is documenting his inability to cite actual code violations, which proves he's either completely incompetent or deliberately manufacturing compliance requirements that don't exist in legitimate emergency protocols. While Michael examines my upgraded emergency access features, I photograph his county identification card with my phone camera, zooming in close enough to reveal printing inconsistencies that suggest counterfeit credentials rather than legitimate government documentation. The formatting looks wrong, the font spacing seems off, and the identification number doesn't match the standard county employee numbering system I've seen on dozens of legitimate inspections during my fire department career. Real county inspectors carry identification that includes specific department codes, emergency contact numbers, and supervisor verification information that Michael's credentials completely lack. His fake identification represents government impersonation, which elevates Nina's property acquisition scheme from civil fraud to federal criminal prosecution. After Michael leaves with promises to review compliance documentation and provide updated violation assessment within 72 hours, I immediately contact Jefferson County Building Inspection to verify his employment status and inspection authority. The county response destroys any remaining doubt about Michael's legitimacy. We have no Michael Stevens employed in building inspection or any other county department. Anyone presenting county credentials for private property compliance inspection without official permits is committing felony impersonation of government officials. The woman I spoke with seems genuinely concerned about credential fraud and requests copies of Michael's identification for investigation by county law enforcement and potential federal prosecution for government impersonation. Hannah Williams contacts her banking industry connections to investigate financial relationships between Michael Stevens and Nina's property development activities, uncovering the payment trail that proves criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate inspection services. Bank records show regular payments from Nina's LLC to Michael Stevens for compliance consultation services, totaling $4,700, $100 over 6 months. Hannah reports while reviewing transaction documentation that establishes systematic fraud rather than occasional consulting work. These payments prove Michael isn't a county inspector conducting a legitimate emergency access assessment. He's Nina's paid accomplice, creating manufactured compliance crises to pressure property owners into distressed sales below market value. Friday evening brings the surveillance windfall that exposes Nina's escalation strategy. Now that my emergency access upgrades have eliminated her original compliance pressure tactics, hidden cameras capture Michael and Nina coordinating their next approach in my driveway, discussing environmental assessment complications since my emergency access improvements made their original violations impossible to manufacture. Wetland proximity concerns and soil contamination possibilities require expensive environmental remediation that forces financial pressure for quick sale. Nina instructs Michael while my concealed surveillance documents their criminal conspiracy planning in crystal clear audio and high-definition video. They think they're conducting private strategy coordination, but they're actually providing evidence for federal prosecution. Nina's environmental escalation plan reveals the systematic nature of her property acquisition fraud scheme, targeting inherited properties throughout Pine Lake. Environmental remediation requirements will force financial pressure when emergency access compliance fails to create distressed sale motivation, she explains to Michael, while my hidden surveillance captures every word of their criminal conspiracy coordination. She's not just targeting my property, she's running systematic pressure campaigns against multiple inherited lots using manufactured compliance crises, fake inspector credentials, and environmental scare tactics to force below-market sales. The scope of her operation extends far beyond individual property harassment into organized fraud, affecting dozens of families throughout our community. The footage shows Nina providing Michael with documentation about soil contamination assessment, protocols, and wetland boundary violation procedures that sound as manufactured as his emergency access compliance requirements. Environmental concerns create immediate property value reduction and expensive remediation costs that motivate quick cash sales. Nina tells Michael while reviewing what appears to be another script for fake authority pressure tactics. My concealed audio captures her admitting that environmental concerns are manufactured to create financial pressure rather than address legitimate environmental problems, which prove systematic fraud using fake government authority to target inherited properties for acquisition below market value. Michael's nervous responses during Friday evening's coordination meeting suggest growing concern about the criminal exposure of their fake inspector scheme. But Nina reassures him that environmental assessment authority is harder to verify than building inspection credentials. What neither of them realizes is that my hidden surveillance is documenting criminal conspiracy for government impersonation, systematic property fraud, and organized acquisition schemes that target inherited properties throughout Pine Lake. Their coordination meeting provides evidence of criminal intent, systematic fraud planning, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies that will destroy their entire operation when presented to federal prosecutors. Saturday morning brings comprehensive evidence compilation that transforms Nina's harassment into criminal prosecution material, fake government credentials, manufactured inspection authority, systematic property targeting, criminal conspiracy documentation, and admission of organized fraud schemes targeting inherited properties. Hannah confirms that documented impersonation of government officials, combined with systematic property acquisition fraud, establishes grounds for federal criminal prosecution with significant prison sentences and financial restitution requirements. Michael's fake credentials represent felony government impersonation, while Nina's coordination proves criminal conspiracy for organized property fraud, Hannah explains while reviewing evidence that will destroy their entire operation. The beautiful irony of Michael's fake inspection visit is watching him search desperately for violations in emergency access features that exceed every possible county standard while being completely unaware that hidden surveillance is documenting his criminal fraud in real time. He thinks he's conducting a legitimate compliance assessment that will provide Nina with a manufactured violation justification. But what he's actually doing is providing evidence of systematic fraud that will send both of them to federal prison. Nina's about to discover that fake county inspectors leave digital footprints, and her environmental assessment backup plan involves someone who just became a documented federal crime statistic with enough evidence for prosecution that will destroy their property acquisition scheme permanently. The next phase of her operation is about to collide with something she never anticipated, a community that's about to learn exactly what she's been doing to their neighbors. Saturday afternoon brings the strategic decision that transforms Nina's next pressure campaign into community education about systematic fraud targeting our entire neighborhood. Instead of waiting for Nina's environmental escalation or whatever fake authority she plans to deploy next, I'm organizing a Sunday evening community presentation to expose her property acquisition scheme before more families become targets of her systematic manipulation. You don't beat organized fraud by fighting individual battles. You educate the community about the entire operation, so everyone can recognize the pattern and protect their properties from coordinated acquisition pressure. My fire department experience taught me that emergency response works best when everyone understands the threat and coordinates their defensive actions rather than fighting isolated incidents. Michelle agrees to host Sunday evening's gathering after I explain how Nina's been weaponizing her genuine medical concerns to legitimize manufactured community pressure against my property. Tommy's discovered something important about recent compliance pressure that affects all our properties and community safety. Michelle announces to neighbors while distributing informal invitations for what she describes as crucial community education about property rights and fraud recognition. Her authentic community relationships provide credibility that transforms my defensive evidence presentation into a neighborhood protection initiative that residents want to attend, rather than a defensive meeting they might avoid. Michelle's genuine concern about emergency access gets satisfied by learning how real compliance works versus manufactured pressure tactics. Sunday evening brings Pine Lake residents gathering around my upgraded gate to learn about systematic manipulation of community concerns for private property, acquisition profit rather than legitimate emergency preparedness or safety enhancement. The professional emergency access features serve as a visual demonstration of authentic compliance versus Nina's manufactured requirements, showing neighbors what real emergency vehicle access looks like compared to pressure tactics designed to force expensive modifications. What we've experienced isn't legitimate emergency compliance enforcement. I explained to gathered neighbors while presenting research evidence without revealing hidden surveillance capabilities that I'm saving for maximum impact. It's organized fraud using fake authority to pressure property modifications for private acquisition profit below market value. The fake credential documentation provides smoking gun evidence that destroys any remaining credibility Nina might claim for her emergency access enforcement campaign. Photos of Michael Stevens' counterfeit county identification displayed alongside authentic county inspector. Credentials show obvious printing and formatting differences that prove systematic credential fraud rather than legitimate government inspection authority. Jefferson County confirms no Michael Stevens employed in building inspection or any other county department. I tell neighbors while displaying official county response documentation. Anyone presenting fake government credentials for property compliance inspection commits felony impersonation of government officials that carries federal prosecution with significant prison sentences. The visual evidence makes Nina's fraud scheme obvious to everyone present. Property acquisition pattern maps reveal systematic targeting of inherited corner lots with subdivision potential throughout Pine Lake, showing coordinated cash purchases at 35% below market value, affecting multiple families rather than random real estate coincidence. Wilson paid $122,000 cash. Foster paid $118,000 cash, both for properties worth over $180,000 based on recent comparable sales. I explain while displaying purchase documentation that proves systematic below-market acquisition, targeting inherited properties. Cash transactions that are far below market value combined with identical emergency access pressure campaigns indicate organized property acquisition, fraud using manufactured compliance crises to force distressed sales. The scope of Nina's operation becomes clear when neighbors see systematic targeting rather than individual harassment. Wilson cracked first. Hired to support emergency access for quick sales paid from Nina's LLC. Foster followed, adding the number 5,000 each if a holdout sold below comps. A murmur rolled through the room. Somebody whispered, "That's not safety, that's a bounty." Michelle's anger about having her genuine health concerns weaponized for Nina's property acquisition scheme represents the moral outrage that unites our community against systematic fraud targeting family properties. You used my authentic medical worries to legitimize criminal property acquisition fraud. Michelle confronts Wilson and Foster directly while other neighbors express similar outrage about the manipulation of community trust. My genuine concern about emergency vehicle access became your weapon against my neighbor's property rights. Her transformation from a manipulation victim to a community protector symbolizes how Nina's systematic fraud backfires when people understand they've been exploited for criminal purposes rather than legitimate community safety initiatives. The protective coalition that emerges from Sunday evening's community education demonstrates how authentic neighborhood relationships defeat manufactured consensus. When residents understand systematic manipulation targeting their family's properties, Real community members unite around property protection rather than compliance surrender, recognizing that Nina's systematic fraud represents an external threat to everyone's property security rather than an internal community safety concern. We've been manipulated into pressuring our neighbor using manufactured requirements that serve property acquisition rather than emergency preparedness. Neighbors acknowledge while expressing support for authentic property improvement versus surrender to fraudulent pressure tactics. Community education destroys Nina's artificial consensus by revealing systematic fraud rather than legitimate community concern. Sunday night's hidden surveillance captures Nina's panicked phone calls discussing community exposure complications and emergency meeting necessity to restore control over systematic property acquisition, operations that depend on manufactured community consensus. Community education threatens systematic pressure campaigns when residents understand property acquisition fraud rather than legitimate compliance enforcement. Nina tells someone during a recorded conversation that reveals desperation about losing community manipulation capabilities. Emergency meeting becomes necessary to address dangerous misinformation about legitimate HOA authority and restore proper community safety compliance cooperation. Her response proves that community education threatens her entire operation by destroying the manufactured consensus she depends on for systematic property acquisition pressure. Catherine's coordination calls reveal systematic property acquisition operations extending beyond Pine Lake into multiple communities where she's running identical manufactured compliance campaigns targeting inherited properties for below-market acquisition. Pine Lake community exposure threatens systematic operations if residents share fraud recognition information with other targeted neighborhoods. Nina explains during a panicked conversation that I have with crystal clear audio quality. Environmental assessment complications require an immediate emergency meeting to restore community compliance cooperation before the systematic property acquisition timeline faces complete disruption. The scope of her criminal operations extends far beyond individual property harassment into organized fraud affecting dozens of communities throughout the region. The intelligence gathering from Sunday night's surveillance reveals Nina's desperation about community exposure, threatening systematic property acquisition operations that depend on manufactured community pressure rather than legitimate compliance enforcement. Her emergency meeting plan represents the last desperate attempt to restore artificial authority and community manipulation capabilities that systematic fraud requires for successful property acquisition below market value. Emergency meeting tonight to address dangerous misinformation about legitimate HOA authority and restore proper community safety compliance cooperation. Nina announces during a recorded coordination call that proves systematic fraud rather than legitimate community governance. What she doesn't realize is that community education has already destroyed her manufactured consensus permanently. Monday morning brings confirmation that Nina's artificial consensus has collapsed permanently as genuine community members recognize systematic manipulation targeting their families' inherited properties, rather than legitimate emergency preparedness or community safety initiatives. Wilson and Foster's confessions about financial incentives and fake employment verification expose systematic fraud using planted community members to create artificial pressure for manufactured compliance requirements. Michelle's transformation from a manipulation victim to a community protector demonstrates how authentic neighborhood relationships defeat systematic fraud when residents understand criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate community concern. Nina's emergency meeting represents a desperate attempt to restore authority that community education has permanently destroyed. Nina's about to call an emergency meeting to restore her authority, not knowing that half her supporters just confessed to fraud conspiracy in front of the entire neighborhood. Tomorrow, I'm not waiting for her next move. I'm turning my gate into a classroom. How to verify credentials, how to read a real citation, and how to shut down manufactured compliance before it starts. The community she thought she controlled is about to watch every criminal word she said while planning systematic property acquisition fraud against their families. By Tuesday evening, the community center hummed with a projector, a backup generator for the PA, and printouts of every email header and payment memo we'd pulled. 10 minutes from now, the word compliance would mean evidence, not intimidation. Emergency meeting tonight to address dangerous misinformation about legitimate HOA authority and restore proper community safety compliance cooperation. Nina announced this morning not realizing she was providing the perfect public forum for her complete criminal exposure through professional surveillance evidence. She thinks community education threatened her authority temporarily, but the emergency meeting will restore the manufactured consensus and pressure campaign effectiveness. What she doesn't understand is that her own meeting becomes the stage where hidden surveillance footage reveals her entire criminal conspiracy to everyone she's tried to defraud. Pine Lake residents pack the community center expecting Nina's authority restoration presentation, but receive complete criminal fraud exposure through court-admissible surveillance evidence that documents a systematic property acquisition conspiracy. The energy feels different from Sunday's community education gathering. People arrive knowing they've been manipulated, but wanting to see how Nina responds to exposure of Wilson and Foster's confessions about systematic fraud. Nina enters with renewed confidence, carrying the same expensive leather portfolio from her original property visit, wearing that predatory authority she thinks will restore community compliance. She has no idea that half her supporters confessed to criminal conspiracy 2 days ago, or that hidden surveillance documented every criminal coordination meeting 4 months. Nina's confident opening about community safety, requirements and emergency access compliance reveals a complete disconnect from the reality of her exposed criminal operation and destroyed community credibility. Recent misinformation about emergency compliance requirements threatens community safety cooperation and property protection initiatives. She begins while setting up professional presentation slides about liability and compliance standards. The irony is beautiful. She's discussing property protection while my hidden surveillance documented her systematic property acquisition, fraud targeting inherited lots throughout Pine Lake. Her presentation feels desperate and rehearsed, like someone trying to restore authority, that community education permanently destroyed through exposure of systematic fraud, rather than legitimate emergency preparedness. Their revelation moment arrives when I interrupt Nina's compliance presentation with evidence that transforms her authority restoration into criminal conspiracy exposure broadcast to a packed community center. I killed the lights and brought the projector up. The screen filled with mailbox meetups, manila folders passing hand to and fingers tracing lot lines like battle plans, slides cut to timestamps, then to the Maple Street Shell address, then to Michael flashing credentials that didn't exist in any county directory. You could see Nina measuring not clearance but frontage, not turning rady but utility tie-ins, not safety but yield. The crowd didn't gasp so much as lean forward together. One click, another angle, the pattern snapping into place. Then the room met the voices. Environmental remediation creates pressure when access compliance doesn't, Nina said on a Thursday night track. The continents crisp through the PA, target inherited corners, push liability. If they cite knockbox, pivot to wetlands. If they pull comps, talk contamination. Michael followed on a different night. Homeowners don't verify IDs. The badge gets you through the gate. The audio rolled into payment memos, subject lines, and calendar blocks named access ups. By the time the lights rose, compliance meant something new. Evidence. Target inherited properties with unclear titles for quick acquisition below market value through manufactured compliance pressure and fake inspector credentials. The surveillance footage shows Nina instructing Wilson and Foster about using authentic neighbor concerns to legitimize manufactured compliance pressure, offering $5,000 each for successful distressed sale facilitation. Community shock spreads through a packed room as neighbors watch their supposed community leader orchestrating systematic fraud, targeting their family's inherited properties while claiming emergency preparedness and community safety authority. The surveillance footage reveals Nina's systematic coordination with a fake county inspector, financial incentives for planted community members, document fraud using vacant office building addresses, and admission of organized property acquisition schemes, affecting multiple neighborhoods throughout the region. She's been running systematic fraud against our entire community, while pretending to care about emergency access. Someone calls out, while others express outrage about a criminal conspiracy targeting family properties. The artificial authority Nina spent months building collapses completely, as surveillance evidence exposes systematic fraud, rather than legitimate community governance. Michelle's confrontation represents moral outrage that unites our community against systematic fraud, targeting family properties through the weaponization of genuine medical concerns and community trust. You used my authentic health worries about emergency vehicle access to pressure my neighbor with fake compliance requirements, Michelle tells Nina directly while pointing at surveillance footage showing coordination meetings behind community mailboxes. You weaponize my genuine medical condition to legitimize criminal property acquisition fraud against inherited family properties. Her anger reflects community sentiment as residents realize Nina exploited authentic neighborhood relationships to create an artificial consensus for systematic property acquisition, rather than legitimate emergency preparedness or community safety initiatives. Additional surveillance footage exposes Michael Stevens admitting to government impersonation and credential fraud designed to create artificial compliance pressure for property acquisition purposes. Counterfeit county credentials work because homeowners don't verify government inspector identification, creating artificial authority for manufactured compliance pressure, Michael's recorded voice explains, while the community watches criminal conspiracy documentation. The footage shows systematic coordination between Nina and Michael, discussing environmental assessment backup plans, wetland violation manufacturing, and soil contamination scare tactics designed to force expensive remediation costs that create financial pressure for distressed property sales. Government impersonation represents federal criminal charges that elevate Nina's fraud scheme to a prosecution level, requiring significant prison sentences. Nina's realization that hidden surveillance documented a criminal conspiracy she believed was private coordination with accomplices creates a moment of complete authority collapse and criminal exposure. Her face goes white as she understands months of criminal coordination meetings were recorded with court-admissible quality, while she thought she was conducting private property acquisition planning. "You've been recording everything," she whispers, while surveillance footage continues broadcasting criminal conspiracy evidence to a packed community center. The hidden cameras she never suspected captured systematic fraud, government impersonation, community manipulation, and organized property acquisition schemes that will provide federal prosecutors with overwhelming evidence for criminal conviction and significant prison sentences. Sheriff's deputies enter the community center during the surveillance evidence presentation to serve felony fraud warrants while a packed room watches. Documented proof of a systematic property acquisition scheme targeting inherited properties throughout Pine Lake. Criminal charges include impersonation of government officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, systematic property acquisition schemes, community manipulation for criminal purposes, and organized fraud affecting multiple families throughout the region. Wilson and Foster face accomplice charges for fraud conspiracy, document fraud, and community manipulation, while Michael faces federal prosecution for government impersonation and systematic credential fraud. The community watches criminal justice unfold in real-time as surveillance evidence, provides prosecutors with comprehensive documentation for federal criminal prosecution. Community protection emerges from criminal prosecution as evidence establishes the Pine Lake Heritage District with permanent protection for inherited properties and mandatory verification requirements for all future compliance claims or inspector credentials. Nina's systematic fraud creates legal precedent protecting inherited family properties from manufactured compliance pressure, fake inspector schemes, and organized acquisition fraud targeting communities throughout the region. Real community relationships defeat systematic fraud through education, coalition building, and comprehensive evidence collection that destroys criminal conspiracy permanently. The surveillance footage that Nina never suspected transforms her own emergency meeting into a criminal trial broadcast to every family she tried to defraud. When the handcuffs clicked on Nina's wrists, she finally understood that her emergency meeting had become her criminal trial. Broadcast in high definition to every family she tried to defraud. Share in the comments if you think property fraudsters like Nina deserve public exposure like this. Have you ever seen fake authority schemes in your neighborhood? What red flags would you watch for now? 3 months later, I'm standing beside my upgraded gate on this perfect autumn morning, watching Pine Lake Heritage Property Protection Day celebrate authentic community improvement and permanent fraud prevention. Criminal prosecution created the Pine Lake Heritage District with permanent protection for inherited properties and mandatory verification for all future compliance claims. My gate serves as a community education center with a permanent FAQ display explaining compliance verification, county contact numbers, code citation requirements, and inspector credential verification. Michelle transformed from a manipulation victim to a community protector, teaching neighbors to verify authority claims rather than surrender to pressure. Property values increased by 30% after the subdivision scheme elimination, while heritage protection enhanced long-term stability. Nina received an 18-month federal sentence with $85,000 in restitution. Michael got a felony conviction for government impersonation, and Wilson and Foster received probation with community service requirements. The right answer to take it down is I'll upgrade it instead and document everything. Sometimes the best defense is building something so superior that fake arguments become impossible.